so proud of a man.
I'm Tommy Salmons. This is Year Zero. Today, I have the great pleasure of interviewing Jonathan Munnier. Jonathan is a respiratory therapist during COVID-19. So there's all kinds of good treats in this episode. But first, RyanBunting.com for all of your graphic design needs. Go to RyanBunting.com. Ryan Bunting is a great anarcho-capitalist and libertarian, and he's also a great graphic designer. He designed my podcast logo and Pete Quinones' podcast logo for Free Man Beyond the Wall. So go to RyanBunting.com for all of your graphic design needs and buy his fucking book. Thank you, my buddy Tom Burton, for the music. Enjoy the show.
Okay, I'm here with Jonathan Munnier. What's going on, man?
Oh, man, just like I said, it's been another busy day. Basically just woke up again at 3 in the morning and took a nap a little bit ago. And working night shift for so many years, I'm not sure. Do you normally do your job throughout the day or the evening?
I try to just stick to the days anymore, man. My body just can't take because the way our schedule's set up, we get 10 hours off in between shifts.
Okay.
So your schedule ends up rotating, right? So you go for 11, 12 hours, you take 10 hours off, and 10 hours later, and then before long, you've gone from 6 in the morning, starting your day at 6 in the morning, to starting your day at 2 in the afternoon. And when I was younger, I had no issues with it, but here the last few years, I'm like, man, I can't do this anymore. It burns you out.
Oh, I completely feel you. I've been working night shift for the past, 7, 8-ish so years, and I work basically 12-hour night shifts, like 3 night shifts a week. So I'm constantly going back and forth between a day and a night shift type of deal. Like I don't have like an actual sleep schedule anymore. So yeah, I mean, whenever I wake up, I just wake up and I can't go back to sleep. But inevitably, it seems like, it's X amount of hours later, and I'm ready for a nap. It's
Right.
so yeah, man. It's just like I said, I'm gonna on my 8-week or not 8-week, but 8-day stretch off before I start my last 2 weeks at the current contract that I'm working, and basically just I'm hoping to have a few weeks off and then heading back out west again. So there's always things going on every day. You know how it is.
Right.
Whenever you finally do have a stretch of days off or something, it's like it's hard to not be motivated to at least get some things done, because you're stuck on the road or you're stuck doing other things. You only have a limited amount of time. It's easier to be focused whenever you have a work environment like that, I think, than it is sometimes even just working a full-time job at home where you're home a lot. So
Right. Well, and for those that have never heard of you and don't know who you are, just give us a little background on who you are, what you do, and all that good jazz.
Sure, man. Odds are pretty much everybody's not heard of me. So I am not a super well-known individual by any stretch of the imagination, but I do. I definitely consider myself a jack of all trades and definitely a master of none. But I'm a respiratory therapist. I also am a bass player, an audio engineer, a podcast host. I also occasionally do DDP yoga instructing, and I'm also a licensed falconer. I do all kinds of stuff. So basically, with the respiratory therapy gig, I've been doing that now for almost 16 years. And I hold the majority. Not that this necessarily matters, but just to give people an extra bit of background on my history. I hold almost, I think, all but one of the credentials that my profession offers from our credentialing agency. I also hold another credential from a different agency, which is a specialization in neonatal pediatric transport. I worked the first, 12 years of my career mainly doing neonatal and pediatric demographics, mostly neonatal. I worked in a few level 3 NICUs and also did neonatal pediatric transport for a couple years. Then I needed a change. To make a very long story short with that, I just needed a change in scenery, so I decided to branch into sleep medicine. I did that for a couple years and tested people for sleep apnea, and then did follow-up titration studies to see what kind of pressures would work for their CPAP and BiPAP machines that they would end up needing. And then the pandemic hit, and as much as that still, I think, is still necessary. Unfortunately, I mean, you're not going to die overnight typically from sleep apnea. It's more of a quality of life thing and a much gradual, like over a long amount of time type of thing with that. So basically, whenever the pandemic hit, I was lumped into the group of quote unquote non-essential testing or non-essential jobs, with a lot of the outpatient procedures and things like that a lot of hospitals were ixnaying towards the beginning of the pandemic, and subsequently kind of shot themselves in the foot with on that. But so basically, I was left with a choice. I could either continue to kind of hang around and wait for my health system that I worked for to come up with a better solution on how they were handling all of the people that were employed under them, that were technically non-essential like me, because they basically shut down my sleep lab that I was working at. And so we were all, just kind of left hanging for a little bit. To give them credit, they tried to come up with solutions at the time to get us hours and keep us working, but the only problem is that at the time the solution was to try and absorb us into the hospitals, working in their actual respiratory staff again. The problem is that the hospitals were so slow. I mean, there was hardly any work for even their normal staff therapists, let alone extra supplemental staff that they were just trying to find work for like us. So that kind of worried me a little bit, and I decided, well, I'm not just going to sit around here and wait for, the other shoe to drop, so to speak. So I'm like, I'm going to try my hand at this whole traveling gig. And so that kind of began my adventures of the last year. So is that right. Kind of enough of a background, you think, on that, or do you?
Yeah, no, I think that gives everybody a good idea of where you're coming from and what your qualifications are to be talking about these subjects and all that, which is, ultimately in today's society, everybody's appealing to authority. So just doing your own research isn't good enough for everyone. Mm-hmm. They want to make sure that you're following the science. So
no, I got you. And yeah, unfortunately, the follow-up kind of asterisk mark to that is the irony is a lot of the professionals and the experts that they're listening to and getting a lot of these directives from and basically just, just not even questioning in a lot of situations, don't even take care of patients. They're just they just do studies and this, that, and the other. But the irony is I think the more actual practitioners that work in a hospital environment or have worked with the patient demographic that has been predominant over the last year for sure, will, probably tell you a lot of the same, concerns and just overall, I don't know, just there's a lot of I think very necessary questioning that needs to be happening with a lot of this stuff, but there's a lot of things too that have basically been hidden in plain sight, that are just, I don't, and I'm not going to sit here and say that the world as a whole has purposely misled anybody or try and necessarily incriminate anybody or anything like that. I'm just saying it's just, there's definitely some things they could have clarified that could have quelled, I think, a lot of the, I guess, the innate fear that developed from a lot of this stuff in the beginning, and they chose not to do that for whatever reason, and they're honestly still not choosing not to do that in a lot of cases. So,
well, I was listening to I don't really know how to pronounce his name right. I think it's Knut Witkowski, and he's a world-renowned virologist, and he was doing an interview, and the guy asked him, he was like, well, a lot of what you're saying doesn't line up with what Dr. Fauci's saying and what we're being told. So how do you explain that? And he said, well, I'm not employed by the government, so I get to actually do science. So
there's a lot to be said for that. And, you also kind of have to be careful too on, who you're listening to. And I'm just going to go ahead and give this disclaimer right up front. And I did this with David's podcast too. And when I was talking to Dave the other day, I'm just one guy. I will say, just to give people an idea of, I've worked in Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, Wyoming, and Montana. I'm pretty sure those are pretty much the main states over this past year. So, I'm one guy. I've worked in 6 different states. But, nobody has to take what I say as gospel by any stretch. I think the purpose of your podcast, and especially, David's podcast and stuff too, is just, I just want people to think. I want people to, use a little bit of basic logic, common sense. If you come to your own conclusion that you don't agree with what I say or what some of these other people are saying, then fine. At least you thought. At least you used your brain and tried to exercise some degree of common sense and logic and try to do your own research instead of just parroting what some of these people have been saying for the last year. So,
well, I know with my audience, a lot of them that I engage with and interact with, they're like me. They're like, what we're seeing on the ground, what we're actually experiencing and witnessing is completely different than what we're being told. And we're just like, none of this is right. Like something is wrong,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there's a lot of things that I've seen over the past year that if if I would have been told that they were going on before I started working around the stuff, I would have been skeptical as well. But one thing that I said right at the beginning of all this, whenever I initially took that first travel contract to New York and then subsequently got canceled, I told myself right after that conversation with the recruiter that no matter what happened from that moment on, everything that I was going to think, feel, and talk about, and share were going to be things that I saw for myself, heard for myself, and kind of experienced for myself. And a lot of the things that I'm going to end up probably talking with you and your audience here are not things that are uncommon knowledge for the most part. They're
right.
they're things that can be found really easily if you just talk. I mean, if you're I mean, heck, if your personal, if you're a family physician, most of your listeners, family physicians, if you just ask them a couple of the main points that I'm going to discuss probably here, if they're real and honest with you, they will probably confirm the things that I said. I'm not trying to speak for anybody else other than myself, but I mean, heck, I had a follow up my annual physical with my doc yesterday, and he was honestly echoing a lot of the same things that I said, and he was initially kind of as dumbfounded as I was that the stuff was going on, but yeah, I mean, it's just just taking into consideration that not everything that you've been told over the last year is 100% accurate. It's not necessarily lying, because they pretty much made it to where the way they've put things out in the media and stuff isn't necessarily lying. It's just not upfront, It's kind of like I was talking the other day. It's more in the terminology and how the terminology is laid out than anything. So
Right. Lies by omission a lot of times.
Mm-hmm.
But well, let's just dive right in. So one of the things you wanted to make sure that you put out there out front was COVID is real. And when you were talking to David, that was one of the first things you said was COVID is real.
Oh yeah.
So give us a little, what is it? Like, what's going on with this disease? And the reason I ask that, or virus or whatever it is, the reason I ask that is because my dad got sick, right?
Mm-hmm.
My dad got sick, and he was sick for about a month.
Mm-hmm.
And he was diagnosed with COVID, but he didn't have a respiratory symptoms. He didn't have flu-like symptoms. It was like a stomach bug that lasted for like 30 days. He lost like 40 pounds. He couldn't keep any food down. And here we are. I mean, I guess he started feeling better in November. So what is that? 6 months, 7 months later, whatever. And he still has hardly any energy. He might be 70%. I mean, so what are we dealing with? Why is it affecting people that way? What is this?
Well, that's a good question, man. I wish I could really honestly tell you 100%. The problem is that they still don't even really know yet why it does what it does, except for the fact that it was such a new virus that everybody, I mean, it was going to affect everybody different, because every bug known to man, pretty much for the most part, to some degree, affects everybody different anyway. I mean, one person can get the flu and have nothing but respiratory symptoms. Another person can get the flu and have other symptoms. I mean, the problem, I think, initially is that the same symptoms that you have with COVID, I mean, are a lot of the same symptoms that you have with the flu and other bugs. The problem is that people were just having the symptoms and suffering from the stuff for just a lot longer than typical, which I think was the first clue that something wasn't quite right whenever all of this stuff first started dropping. So, I mean, it's a different kind of, it's just a different kind of bug. It's a new bug. So therefore, it's going to have a much wider variety of responses for a much wider variety of people. The one thing that I can tell you for sure that has been consistent that I've noticed with the media and what I've observed, what's been reported, is that it does really hit the elderly demographic very hard. Your 70 plus, age demographic, and it hits people really hard that are immunocompromised already, and especially obese or have other like comorbidities, or other conditions. Those are the people that,
Right.
that are, I mean, that's one very, those are the major commonalities as far as what I've personally seen and what's been reported in the media. And you're always going to have, with any disease, pretty much, you're always going to have your outliers. You're always going to have your 20-something-year-old that randomly gets something goes to the ICU and then dies. I mean, that's the flu. That's any bug, and,
Right.
and this was going to be no exception. And I've seen some fairly young people that have been pretty sick with this. I've also seen some older people that turned out to be just fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I to answer your question, they still don't really know exactly, all the, especially with the things starting to mutate now. I mean, I know what they've been finding with some of these other like mutations too is that it's more virulent, like it spreads more, but it doesn't necessarily make you sicker. So, I mean, the thing that's the problem is they're just starting to kind of learn some of the tendencies after a year, but now it's already starting to change. so they still don't know exactly what we're dealing with to an exact degree, but I wish I could be a little bit more specific, but I have to be honest and just say, it's kind of a crapshoot. I mean, the majority of people are presenting with respiratory symptoms, but the majority of people, like myself, when I had it back in December. When I had it, I kind of had similar to what you said it was your dad, right?
Yeah.
I kind of had some GI stuff for a few weeks, and then I had like a week or so where I really didn't have any symptoms, and then it started having basically the equivalent of a bad sinus infection. And I had gotten tested with the rapids, which are completely worthless, by the way. I hold no faith or validity hardly at all anymore in these rapid tests. They suck. I tested negative twice with the rapids before I tested positive with the Cepheid. I have a hard time pronouncing that word, but it's the other more in-depth nasopharyngeal swab that they do that test. And I actually had the second rapid I had done. I had the other swab done at the same time, and the other one they had to send into the state for whatever reason, and and I tested negative. And so I wasn't running a high enough fever to not work at the time. So I ended up working, and I was still in Wyoming at the time. I ended up working for 4 days in a row. We're getting with overtime with it. I was positive. I didn't know until the following Monday because they tested me on Christmas Eve, I think, which was like a Friday or something. And since it was the weekend, it was the state. I wasn't going to get the results back. So I ended up working like 4 nights in a row, and ended up finding out on the following Monday I was positive, so I had already worked like 4 days at least being positive, and but I mean, basically it was, for me, it was just a bad sinus infection, and other people that I talked to or have worked with that also worked for some of the different state agencies said that the majority of the people that were presenting like it was just a bad sinus infection, and your more severe cases were usually almost always in that demographic that were either elderly, obese, had other issues going on, et cetera, et cetera. So,
my dad is diabetic. He's in his 60s.
That's another big one.
And it was really strange because my mom took care of him the entire time, I mean, he was sleeping 15 hours a day, and she was taking care of him the whole time. She never tested positive, so
yeah,
it's she's just, I don't know, one of those people that's completely immune to it for whatever reason.
Well, and I mean, does your mom do any of the day-to-day preventative stuff, and does she have any of those other like comorbidities or other health conditions?
Yeah.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing what a simple multivitamin, some extra vitamin D, and not being unhealthy in general will do for you.
Right.
There's a lot of, it's overlooked a lot. So.
Yeah. But so while you were while this was all taking off, you were traveling around, and you had mentioned earlier about you were going to go to New York. So tell the audience about that story, because that when I heard you say that, I was like, none of this doesn't even make sense. Like, I don't even understand how you know, as a respiratory therapist, could have even, you know, absorbed that information, you know?
Yeah, it was tough. It still is tough.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, in hindsight, after hearing some of the stories that I've heard from different travelers that I worked with that did work there, I'm kind of glad that it worked out that I didn't go there. But basically what happened was, once I decided I was going to do the traveling gig, I got on the phone and got with a company, did the application process, yada yada, and basically they accepted me. I signed the contract, and I was slated to go out and work in a part of New York for one of the health systems out there. About 4 days before I was supposed to fly out there and leave, I was called by the recruiter and told that my contract, along with a lot of others, you know, hundreds if not thousands of these contracts, were being canceled. And, you know, leading up to that point, you know, I was trying to figure out, like, because it was my first experience with doing a travel contract in healthcare. You know, you're still learning the ins and outs of what you're protected by, what you're not protected by, you know, what you're covered and stuff. So I was under the impression that I would still be getting paid something, you know. But what a lot of people don't realize with healthcare contracts is they can cancel you up until the day that you show up, and they owe you nothing. Like, you don't get a penny. They don't owe you a penny, you know, nothing. So she calls and says that all these contracts, including mine, are canceled, you know, 4 days before I'm supposed to leave. And I'm like, wow, I'm screwed. I'm like, well, I'm still going to be getting paid at least like a couple weeks or so, right? And she's like, no, you would have had to start working before, you know. So I'm like, well, shit. You know?
Yeah.
You know, so I'm kind of starting to panic, because by that point it had been, you know, 2-3 weeks, and, you know, I'm not able to claim unemployment and stuff because I technically didn't get laid off. Like, the health system that I worked for, they were refusing to lay people off, but they were making the employees make the decision on whether or not they wanted to stick it out or, you know, go and find work elsewhere. So I'm starting to freak out a little bit, and I'm like, well, I mean, out of curiosity, I mean, why did all these contracts get canceled? And she was just like, well, what I was told by the healthcare system that had all these contracts, what they told us is that 80% of the people that they had that were, you know, down with COVID, or, you know, 80% of their patients that had COVID that they were taking care of were pretty much, they were dying. So they didn't feel like they needed the extra help anymore. And I was just like, okay, that reeks of complete and total BS, you know, to me. But whatever. You know, I mean, I'm like, do you not still have to take care of people until they die too? I mean, like, you know, even if that was true, you know, which it's whatever. I mean, she's just a recruiter, you know. I mean, you can't sit there and argue, and, you know, it is what it is at that point. You know, there's nothing you can do about it. So I'm like, okay.
But still, I mean, as a medical professional, you're dedicating your life to this particular agenda, to helping people. That's what you want to do. And you're being told that you can't do your job because, well, they're going to die anyway, you know, like, whatever. Why offer them any kind of, you know, medical care if they're going to die anyway?
Yeah. And the thing is there's a lot of things that have been told in the media, especially when all this stuff started, that were like, they weren't necessarily untrue, but they weren't like happening in the frequency that you're being led to believe. Like, you remember like hearing when all this stuff started is, oh, we're in such dire straits, we're waiving, licenses, which they were, and we're also reinstating retired licenses, or licenses to retired people that want to come back and work, and whatever. So you're being basically led to believe that like grandma and grandpa are just scooping them up off the streets, and if they're willing to work, then they can come work and whatever, and this, that, and the other. And
right.
And so that was another question I had for this recruiter, was like, okay, so what about all the reports then that they're just so drowning for help there and stuff, that like this doesn't make any sense? Like, if they're hurting for help this bad, and they're like bringing all these people out of retirement and stuff to come work and whatever, then, and she's like, well, don't believe everything that you've been told in the media as far as that goes. That's kind of being over exaggerated. You still have to you still have to be able to keep up with a workload, and you still have to have the skill set, and they're not just taking everybody off the street to work in these or work for these agencies and stuff. And so,
right.
And I was just like, okay,
right.
So I mean, which one is it? What reality is it here? And the thing is New York wasn't the only state that was getting like government, state government funding to bring in people for these rumored like exorbitantly high, contracts. I mean, healthcare workers were making some big money if they were willing to travel, but those contracts weren't as frequent as what I think a lot of people were led to believe. And a lot of those contracts were only that big because they were being state government funded. So the irony is that a lot of the instances, the hospitals weren't even really having to fit the majority, if hardly any of the bill for those people's services. It was the government funding those contracts with the travel contract companies. So,
right.
There's a lot of stuff and a lot of semantics and logistics going on, kind of behind the scenes. But to me, it just didn't make any sense. If you're hurting that bad, whatever, then, why the hell are you canceling all these contracts? And the only thing I could come down to is the fact they just didn't want to pay for them anymore. But, it's neither here nor there. I hate to speculate on that too much, but bottom line is it is what it is. So.
Well, yeah, that was one of the questions I had, and I doubt you have the answer for it. So, I mean, I'm not asking you, but one of the questions that led me down was who canceled these contracts. Was it Cuomo that canceled them? Was it de Blasio? Was it the hospital? Who canceled these contracts? And I'm thinking, if it comes out that Cuomo, which I wouldn't put it past him or de Blasio for saying something like this, if it comes out that Cuomo said, well, we don't need all this extra additional help because 80% of these patients are going to die anyway. I mean, you add that on top of the entire scandal of him putting COVID positive people in nursing homes and just creating this devastating effect in the nursing home industry. I mean, this guy is just on the line for so much murder at this point. It's insane.
Well, yeah, I mean, without speculating too much into the political side of all of that, the only thing I can say from what I've experienced in a year's experience of traveling now, which isn't a ton, but I've learned a lot in how these contracts work. The hospital usually has to be the one that cancels them. They're the ones that usually deem whether or not they need the staffing help anymore or not. And it's their responsibility to cancel them if they don't want to be on the hook for them. So, I mean, whether or not that decision is partially made because they're not receiving X amount of funding anymore or whatever the case may be, that's a whole other issue. But in a nutshell, usually it's the hospital that decides that they want to cancel those contracts. So
now, when this happened, was this during that period of time last year when when they were putting everybody on respirators?
Yeah, this was in April. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just saw a story a few days ago that they admitted that they knew respirators were going to kill a lot of people, but they felt it was necessary to slow the spread of the disease throughout the hospitals.
Well, and that's why I said whenever once again, without throwing shade or throwing stones or trying to necessarily incriminate anyone that was involved in working, and doing some of these things. Because I mean, the truth of the matter is that everybody at the beginning of the pandemic was going off of what had already been experienced in like Italy and in like New York, and what they were doing. Once I heard what they were doing in a lot of instances, from a respiratory therapist standpoint, it really makes no sense what they were doing. You wouldn't ever do that on a normal basis. So basically, the only logical conclusion that you can come to is that they were doing a lot of these things basically out of fear. There was a lot of unknowns at the time with the virus, and I think there was so much propaganda being put out there that was causing so much fear in the minds of these practitioners and doctors, etc., that the first instinct was to basically intubate anybody that comes in presenting with any of these symptoms, which ironically enough, like I said earlier, are symptoms that you can you can have in a lot of other diseases or illnesses or whatever. But what they were doing basically was, I mean, they were intubating a lot of people coming in that really shouldn't have been. I mean, there's kind of a process that you go through typically whenever you decide how to treat people, as far as like whether or not you're going to non-invasively or invasively, ventilate someone, et cetera, et cetera. Do you want me to go into that at all, or do you think that's unnecessary?
No, you can, because I think it's important to understand what was being considered when they were taking these steps.
Right. Okay. Well, I mean, for everybody that doesn't know, and you wouldn't know because like the profession really didn't get much publicity, ironically enough, during all of this, especially for it being a respiratory pandemic. It's like I mentioned in David's podcast, I don't necessarily feel like, I need any special thank yous or treatment or whatever for doing what I do. That's not what I'm about. But it would have been nice for the profession had we gotten a little bit more recognition in what we do during all of this, because the respiratory therapists are the ones that manage the vents. And in a lot of places, we also put in the airways. We're the ones that intubate in a lot of places. We're the ones that draw the arterial blood gases and run the labs in a lot of places, so we can tell what a patient's breathing status is. We're the ones that, unfortunately, most of what people know our profession for is just basically giving a bunch of breathing treatments, nebulizers. And really that's the least important thing that we really do. It's the thing that we do the most, but it's actually the least important. So, and we're also the ones that make recommendations on whether or not someone should be intubated or not, or non-invasively ventilated with either CPAP or BiPAP or high flow nasal cannula, whatever. But from a respiratory standpoint, all that being said, from a respiratory standpoint, basically, it doesn't make any sense to just straight up intubate somebody just because they come in with some of these symptoms, but they're still okay at the time. And what you said is unfortunately kind of true, because what they were afraid of is, and the reason why they weren't doing non-invasive ventilation a lot in the beginning of all this is they were afraid that the particulates and the droplets were going to get shot everywhere and everyone was going to catch it and get sick. And for those that really don't understand much of this, whenever you intubate somebody, I mean, you're putting in an artificial airway. You're putting in that endotracheal tube that then gets connected to a circuit that's closed and connects to a ventilator that has a filter on it, which once a piece of equipment like that's kind of exposed to that, you're going to end up having to clean it better in a lot of cases anyway. But anyway, whenever you hook a patient up to this vent, it provides a closed circuit so that a lot of those particulates aren't spread anywhere near as easily. So, the ventilator's the ventilator's the thing that is pushing pressure into the patient's lungs and then letting them exhale. And it's doing it all internally within a circuit, a breathing circuit, and it just the pressure kind of goes back and forth within the machine. So it doesn't, unless you disconnect the patient from the circuit, it's not, those particulates and stuff aren't going to get out very easily. Whereas if you ventilate somebody non-invasively, like via a mask or something, a mask, you can form a decent seal with it, but inevitably there's going to be, either through the exhalation port in that circuit or through other instances, those particulates are going to get out. I mean, there's no avoiding it.
Right.
So was that layman enough, you think, for everybody as far as?
Yeah, I think so. I think I get it. My question would then be, who was making this call?
A lot of the doctors, and
they were just telling the respiratory therapist, even if the respiratory therapist was saying, I don't think it's necessary.
Well, I mean, so going back to it, basically, there was a lot of, initially when all this stuff happened, and a lot of the information started coming out with a lot of this stuff. Like I said, there was a lot of fear and concern that everybody was going to get sick from this. And then not only were people like fearing for their lives, so to speak, because of what was being, spread information wise, but the hospitals were also.
Sorry, I chuckle every time I hear that phrase. I'm sorry.
Yeah. I know, but
I think about a cop murdering somebody or something, like I feared for my life.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the sad truth of it though is that's really what it boiled down to. People were scared that they were going to get sick themselves, and then the hospitals were scared that they eventually weren't going to have anybody to take care of any of these people because other people were going to get sick. So I heard with my own ears certain people, particularly like some ER docs, say, well, I mean, if they come in presenting like this, we're just going to go ahead and intubate them so we don't have to deal with any of this. And it doesn't, I mean, from a fear standpoint, it makes sense, but from a practitioner standpoint and a healthcare standpoint, it doesn't make any sense because
it seems like that would just prolong the problem.
Well, and it did, and I think that, and to their credit, they kind of came to their senses quicker. Unfortunately, not quick enough in some instances, I think. Yeah. But once again, I'm not trying to throw shade or throw stones. I mean, it is what it is. I mean, I'm not talking bad about anybody. I'm just simply stating the reality, and the reality is that they were, putting in artificial airways and ventilating people, and basically, in a lot of cases, I mean, more or less having to let a lot of those people just kind of go, because, I mean, there were therapists that I talked to during my travels who worked in New York, and I mean, they were telling me that, I mean, some nights they were going out and having to check on 50 different vent patients. Just them, and that workload is insane. Like it's impossible. Like you're not going to understandably be able to give any degree of reasonable care to anybody if you have 50 vents that you have to check. I mean, a fairly high load, for one person to be able to do everything you need to do, I mean, would be, I mean, we're talking like, 9, 10. I mean, there's places sometimes you'll go out with, somewhere in the teens or whatever as far as but I mean, like, that you're getting once you hit that point, like you're getting to the point where you're really stretched, very thin, and I mean, doing what you're supposed to be able to do. And I mean, typically most places you check a ventilator, every 3 to 4 hours, in a lot of places. Sometimes they even are more overkill and will have you check them every 2 hours or whatever. But I mean, some of these travelers that I encounter, they said that basically they were told at the start of their shift, if you can just do one vent check on each of these patients, like we'll consider it, like that's all you can do. If you can just do one vent check for each of these 50 patients and, just try and get through them all for your 12-hour shift, then, then that's about all you're going to be able to do. And that's nuts. I mean,
Yeah.
and like I said, I'm not saying that, like I said, I'm not trying to incriminate anybody or talk bad about anybody, but like putting like nobody is going to be successful under those circumstances,
Right. Yeah, no, for sure.
So, but I mean, basically, yeah, I mean, it's just more or less there was a lot of things that were done. I mean, like there were patients that were coming in only requiring like a couple of liters, like nasal cannula flow and stuff. I mean, just basically oxygen in their nose and stuff, going and present with shortness of breath or cough or whatever, that would then get intubated and then shipped up to ICU and then extubated like an hour or two later, because they go up to ICU and they'd be like, why are these people intubated? Like these people don't need to be intubated.
Yeah.
And then, once the patient starts waking up from sedation, and I mean, and I'm right now, let me specify this particular instance of what I'm talking about right now, I actually heard a little bit later in the timeline in places other than New York. Okay. This was like after they started kind of figuring out that, that wasn't the best way to do things. So like, I have other friends that work in other hospitals that I've worked with throughout my career, and they were telling me, like, they said they would, some of these ER docs, for example, would intubate these people and they go up to ICU, and at this particular place, for example, the intensivists that were the doctors in the ICU, they were also pulmonologists. So that's always kind of a good combination, to have. But these patients would get up there, and their blood gases, their labs, like their, to tell whether or not their breathing status was good or bad, maybe like normal, or even like better than normal, like bad the other direction, like you're overventilating somebody because they don't need the extra help, And they'd extubate these people like an hour or two later. The patient comes fully awake again from sedation, realizes that they just had this breathing tube put in them, and now they've got, not only do they have a normal hospital charge now for being admitted, but now they've got an ICU charge plus a ventilator charge and stuff that they're going to have to end up paying for that they didn't even necessarily need because of these decisions being made. So that's a whole other can of worms right there too. And, and unfortunately, I mean, I think that there was also a lot of patients that were put in ICUs at first too. And don't get me wrong, I mean, there's some sick people from this stuff. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not.
Yeah, for real.
I'm not going to sit here and say that there weren't plenty of sick people. I mean, I saw it for myself. I mean, there was a lot of sick people during this. I'm not going to take anything away from that. But there were also a lot of not so sick people in this. Like almost way more. I saw way more not sick people than, with COVID diagnoses in the hospital that were being kind of kept in the hospital for X amount of days, whether that be in the floor and the ICU. and the unfortunate part of that too is I think that, a lot of the hospitals lost so much money initially because they got rid of their elective procedures and everything else that hospitals make most of their money from surgeries and elective procedures. They don't make most of their money from hospital stays for the most part. So basically, because they got rid of all their elective procedures and did away with all that because of the risk of the extra exposure in their mind, they lost a lot of money. I mean, there was a lot of health systems that were borderline bankrupt, towards the beginning of last year. So I I can tell you pretty much there was a lot of patients, I think, that were admitted and ended up staying longer than they needed to in a lot of cases with some of this also. So simply so a lot of these hospitals could recoup a lot of their money. I mean, that's kind of a sad thing too. And, I don't think a lot of people realize the difference in the typical day charge for, a floor hospital bed versus an ICU bed either. I think I was looking at it recently, and I think the average cost for just a normal hospital bed on average is around like $15,000 a day or something like that. Just something.
Jesus.
Yeah, I mean it's 10 to 15. I can't remember the exact figure, but I mean it's pretty expensive. But once you go to ICU though, that jumps up to like 45,000 ish, a day.
Right. Yeah.
And I mean, once again, not talking bad about anybody per se, but those hospitals got to make their money back somehow. And ironically enough, a lot of them ended up making a lot of their money back and more by the end of the year. At any rate, that kind of was digressed a little bit there, but sorry.
No, that's completely all right. You actually made me think of something. A friend of mine sent me an article from the Telegraph, and the article was saying that for every 3 people that died of COVID, 2 people died because of the lockdowns, because they weren't able to get their elective, procedures and, what they call elective, but, for cancer treatments and this, that, and the other. And I was like, man, I mean, that's criminal, just and this ties in with the whole fear aspect. The way that they implemented on society this lockdown and forced people out of work and created these health scares that eventually cost a bunch of people their lives that may not have died otherwise.
Yeah, I completely feel you. And to go an extra step there too, I still want to see the most. The irony is I can't even find. I've looked for it. I can't even find the figure of how many people died from suicide and other mental illnesses during all this too.
I can't find it either.
And
I've looked. I can't find it either.
Yeah, I wonder if that's a weird coincidence that you can't find that statistic either. But I mean, it's sad, and the saddest part about all of this is simply not being able to question without a bunch of other people coming out of the woodwork and basically calling you a grandma and grandpa killer or throwing shade for just wondering just exactly how valid all of this was. And
well, you do have to sympathize somewhat with their point of view, because if all the 70-year-olds died, who would they vote for?
Yeah, I mean the thing is,
there'd be no more boomers around, man. We can't live without our boomers. We got to keep the boomers around.
Well, everybody dies someday, so I mean, that's just reality.
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe. Well, I mean, as of right now, it's reality. So, I mean, right. The thing is I think the biggest problem in all this was just there was so much intentional fear, I think, put in people's minds that what little bit of basic discussion that people could have had with all this just went out the window, and people were using a lot of exceptions to the rule as the kind of decision maker in their mind as to whether or not they should or shouldn't do things, rather than just the blatant facts of the matter, which, you know, I'm sorry, you're never, from what I've seen, you're never going to be able to convince. I mean, don't get me wrong. It's like I said the other day, I want to be convinced that all of this stuff was worth it. Like I really would be, because that would then mean that the year that I spent away from my family, just feeling like I had to provide income and, keep everything rolling and stuff, was worth it. And all the extra people that died outside of that we just brought up, they didn't necessarily die for no reason. I really want those things to be validated. I really do. But from what I've seen, and I mean, even other really intelligent epidemiologists, virologists, even some other, pathologists that I know, that I've talked to and had long discussions with about a lot of this, even the ones that are, are the mask defenders and, just the very science-based statistic defenders and all of this, all the ones I've talked to have agreed that there was no need for a lockdown. I mean, it was beyond overkill. And what a lot of people need to realize is what we did wasn't a true lockdown or a quarantine anyway. Well, what we did was a joke. I mean,
yeah,
it was just enough. It was just enough to basically cripple an economy, and there was no way that any kind of measure they were putting into place, there was no way that it was going to contain anything. I mean, as long as people are allowed to get out and be around each other, I don't care if they're wearing masks or not. I mean, N95, you might be able to argue a little bit more or whatever, but like, if people are in proximity to each other, to some degree or another, you're gonna be exposed to not just COVID, but everything. I mean, so it is what it is. I mean, we have to live with it now. I mean, it's done. What's done is done.
Right.
But
yeah,
I mean, even the people that I know and trust, I mean, we've been able to have some good discussions about a lot of this stuff. But I mean, the one thing, even, it's like my one pathologist friend, he was just like, well, I mean, okay, mandate masks, go ahead. Go ahead and just mandate them nationwide everywhere, but leave the stuff open, like leave restaurants open. And let's just be real. The whole restaurant thing is the prime example of why all of these measures were basically a giant joke. Like, you're telling me that I got to wear a mask into a building until I sit down, and then it's okay not to, like, what the hell is that? I mean, come on.
Airplanes too.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean,
we got a social distance all the way up until we sit right on top of each other in this little tube.
Yeah, it's so dumb, and I'm sorry, if anybody, I mean, you're, like I said, you're welcome to disagree, or okay, whatever. I mean, but you're never going to be able to convince me that that's rational. I'm sorry, but
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you had also talked about how different it was going in your traveling, how different it was each job you took, which I found that interesting.
Oh yeah,
because there was a point in time. I mean, at some point in time, there's standard operating procedure that takes hold. We're like, okay, this works. We understand this works, and this is what we're going to do. And you were talking about how it's been so sporadic everywhere you've gone.
Oh yeah. It's I mean, the biggest things with the PPE. I mean, there's places that were kind of like, okay, we're going to give you pretty much everywhere that you go, you had to wear some kind of mask the whole shift, or whatever. I mean, the majority of the time, at least when you're around patients and stuff. Excuse me. So basically, I mean, in the very beginning, the irony is that they were even like, okay, cloth masks go. I mean, a lot of places you're like, okay, I mean, even cloth masks, you go in and you can wear one as long as you got something covering your face, which that was one of the biggest hurdles mentally for me to jump was, okay, so you've been telling me for the past however many decades now that cloth masks don't do anything. And if I would have worn a cloth mask into work, like even a month or two before I did, like I would have been laughed at and probably like just fired on the spot or whatever, or reprimanded. And now it's like, not only is it okay, it's like we encourage this, Not to mention the fact that, I mean, there was such a scare initially about there being such a lack of PPE that, I mean, still to this day, I mean, you end up wearing kind of the same, surgical mask or just basic mask or whatever for a whole like 12-hour shift pretty much. I mean, some places they'll make you wear the same. Others you can, their stuff's more, they make it more readily available, so you can dispose of a mask if you go into an isolation room of some kind. But like everywhere's kind of been different. N95s you're supposed to wear for, reuse for multiple days in a lot of places, which any kind of PPE, if you would have gotten caught reusing at all, like before all of this stuff happened, like you would have gotten your nuts slammed in a drawer and like, reprimanded on the spot. Like, that would be like an instant major write-up, because of worries of cross-contamination. Then like overnight, all of a sudden, oh, it's okay. And not only is it okay, we need to do it because we might run out of this or run out of that. But the irony is I never worked in one place. Where there was a PPE shortage. Not one. And I'm not saying that there wasn't everywhere, but in all the places that I worked, there wasn't really a PPE shortage. If nothing else, they were hoarding this stuff. Like it was, I mean, there were places that I worked where, the extra PPE and stuff were under lock and key under so-and-so's, office or whatever. So people couldn't get to it. They were afraid everybody was going to make off with it or whatever. And so, we're reusing these masks and these different forms of PPE and stuff because they're scared of it, not being available. But you kind of, the whole logic there didn't make sense really for me either. I mean, it, like I said, that was the PPE thing was the biggest variance and discrepancy as far as how different places were doing all of that. Some, and then like their donning and doffing procedures and things like that, the order, like I'm glad I missed out on this, but a couple of places I was at, they said that there were like, supervisors or administrative people or infection control people like standing outside of these patient rooms and stuff, like monitoring how, either nurses or RTs or whoever were like putting on and taking off this, the gowns and equipment and stuff. And I mean, how much is that really going to, I mean, like sitting there and peering over your shoulder and trying to make someone else's job that much more difficult isn't really going to get you any further either. It's just going to create a more tense work environment, so luckily a lot of those places stopped doing that before I got to them. But yeah, I mean, there's just little variances and how I mean, there were some places that weren't even letting people use N95s at first. They were just letting them use PAPRs, which, the PAPRs, I don't know if you know what those are. Those are those like hoods that you put on with like the the tube that goes in the back and it's got the little fan, the air purifier circulator thing. So I mean, and like I said, I mean, it was literally different from place to place to place. And it was funny too how quick things changed also from, okay, if you have a certain type of unit or if you have a certain assignment, like you're not supposed to have COVID patients. And like those policies changed within like a week. Like it's like, okay, well, if you have the neonatal intensive care unit, you don't have COVID patients in your assignment. You've got the parts, but the problem is like in some of the places they were having to start supposedly putting these COVID patients like everywhere, right? So there really wasn't anywhere that you could have an assignment that didn't have COVID. So, within like a week time span, be like, all right, well, what you're going to do now is you're going to go do your checks and stuff in the NICU, and then you're going to just not go back there unless they absolutely need you. And then you're going to have to rechange your scrubs and stuff before you go back, and this, that, and the other. And I mean, stuff was changing constantly. Even just the places I was at, even just the times that I was there, let alone everywhere across the country. And yeah, it's just weird. I mean, and the whole eyewear thing too, I never understood. Like, so one of the places I was at, it was okay forever to like, not necessarily have to wear eyewear unless you're in contact with COVID patient. Like if you were going to go in and give a neb to a COVID patient, like you had to wear eyewear and stuff in those rooms. But like in the other parts of the hospital, you didn't have to, which made total sense to me until I come back to work another day and they're like, okay, well, you got to wear eyewear like everywhere now. And I'm like, what good is that going to do? It's an aerosol. Like an aerosol can get in and around eye shields.
Yeah.
Like this makes no damn sense. Well, it's policy now. Got to do it. Okay. All right. Whatever. I mean, going other places, they don't care.
If it makes you feel better, PPE requirements in every industry is like that.
Doesn't surprise me.
I used to work for a company moving steel bars is what we did. And so I was running a flatbed hauling steel bars. These bars weighed about 30,000 pounds a piece, but we had to wear a hard hat. I guess so that people like you had to pick fragments out of our brain when they were trying to determine what killed us. Yeah.
Well,
I mean, a lot of fucking good that would have done.
So what you're saying is a lot of those people died from COVID, right?
Yeah, that's what it sounds like. Yeah, we can get into that.
Yeah, that'll be one of the next segues, I guess. But yeah. So
yeah. Well.
Yeah.
I need to get off. Probably in the next 15 minutes. I got to get back on the road. So when we cover that, we'll wrap it up after that.
Okay. Well, like I said, I mean, as far as that goes, there's a lot of there's been a lot of discrepancies, but I mean, once in general, once I found out just the overall discrepancies in the numbers and how they were being reported, and I guess this is just as good of a time to segue into that kind of stuff as any. I mean, once I found out how they were reporting the cases and also the deaths, it pretty much sold me that everything that was being done for the most part was just being done out of complete irrational judgment. And politics, unfortunately, I think we're involved in a lot of it. But I mean, what a lot of people don't realize is the case numbers that are being reported, like whenever you see on like CNN or whatever, 4,000 blah 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 new cases in a day in this area or whatever. Well, they report that and portray that like that means like 4,000 something new people, but in reality, all that means is just positive tests. So basically, like, say you end up testing positive and you have to stay home until you have a negative result. Like, if you have 10 subsequent positive results before you get that negative that lets you go back to work, each of those 10 positive results are reported as cases. So like, so basically, like, you can, I mean, and like, there's no designation in people. It's just positive results, and that's how those are reported.
Right.
So a lot of people don't realize that. And once I found that out, I was just like, so you're telling me one person can count as like 8 or 10 potentially, and this is happening like possibly all over the country? I was just like, you gotta be
Right.
shitting me. So it was a big
Yeah,
revel.
it's kind of like an election. Just because Biden got 81 million votes, it doesn't mean it was 81 million different people. He just got 81 million votes.
Well, yeah. Once again, there's a lot of
Oh, I feel the same about Trump too.
yeah,
So don't
yeah.
don't think I'm picking
Oh
sides
no,
here.
no, I don't. I mean, yeah, I had that debate with some friends and stuff too, and they were just so just so mindset that there could be no real fraud and this, that, and the other to any major degree, and especially with the mail-in ballots and this, that, and the other. And I'm just like, that's kind of a very interesting blanket statement to make. But at any rate,
It's very privileged statement. I mean, how privileged do you have to be to have not lost mail at the post through the postal system?
yeah,
That's a very privileged position.
I don't know. At least what admittance they had was just like, well, I mean, it would be negligible as far as the overall impact. But anyway, yeah. And then especially and then after that, once I heard, they're basically, the people started showing up in ER with gunshot wounds and stuff, and they had COVID at the same time, so it was ruled a death, with COVID or whatever, and that
With COVID,
yeah, and
yeah.
that's the
playing those word games.
Yep. So I mean, I'm sorry, I find it extremely hard to believe that 500,000 people have died from COVID. They haven't. I mean, I'm sorry. Just there's no way. Just after seeing what I've seen, even the people. I mean, and that's not even making the argument with the whole the comorbidity thing. With I mean, it's just, I'm sorry if someone comes in with they in a car wreck and they're mangled,
Mm-hmm.
and they just so happen to have COVID at the same time. They didn't die of COVID. They died from a damn car wreck. Same
Right.
thing with a gunshot wound.
Right.
But I mean, I don't know how much the numbers were skewed in that regard, but probably not obviously near as much as the overall the case thing. But yeah, I mean, geez, it's I mean, it's got to be not an insubstantial number, I wouldn't think, but.
Well, I think the flu was the only COVID death the media didn't cover.
Yeah, and that's the other thing too that a lot of people don't realize also is, I mean, don't get me wrong, there's still a lot of places that were testing for the flu, but that was only usually after, in a lot of cases, they tested negative from COVID first.
Right.
Because you don't get shit for for reimbursement or anything extra.
Right. Well, and we need to say that too. A lot of this boiled down to the money that the federal government, whether the Medicare system or whatever, was paying out to these hospitals for testing these people with COVID. I mean, typically, if somebody gets shot in the head, you're not going to test them and see if they have the flu. You're not going to test them and see if they had a damn cold. The only reason they were testing them is because they could get money if they tested positive.
Correct.
Right. So there was no other reason. And I've heard it said it was anywhere between 13,000 and 39,000 per case of a positive test. So there was no other reason to be counting those people other than it was a scam, and a way of laundering money.
Yeah, I mean, whatever verbiage or terminology you want to use, I mean, the reality is hospitals got more money for COVID cases or COVID,
Right.
instances than not, period. I mean,
Right.
however you want to look at that is however you want to look at that, but that's the reality. I mean, they were getting more reimbursement for people with COVID than not. So, but
Right.
I mean, yeah, it's just like I said, it all goes back to the terminology. And hey, I mean, if you're allowed to use this particular system in a certain way, and that actually is playing by the rules in that given moment, then it is what it is. Once
Right.
again, so, but
Yeah.
But I mean, is there anything else that you want to cover real quick before you got to skedaddle, or?
Well, I mean,
there was this whole situation last year about hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, and its utility in treating COVID. But I'm not sure how familiar you are with that subject.
A little bit. Um, the best I can tell you is the places that the one or two places that I was at that were using the hydroxychloroquine, they did say they did have a lot of good treatment outcomes with it, but I think that there was a concern in some instances over the cardiac side effects that it that it provides, that so they stopped using it in a lot of cases. As far as the others, I don't really have much experience with those, but the one place in particular that I was at that did use hydroxychloroquine a lot, they said that they were able to eliminate like the COVID aspect a lot quicker, but they said it in a lot of patients they were seeing some cardiac side effects they didn't want, which, I mean, who knows necessarily without a long-term, study whether or not those could be caused just from byproduct of just having COVID or whatever. But there was other friends that I talked to about it, though, that worked in places they're using a lot, and they said generally very good things about the treatment outcome with it. But once again, that's just one of those things.
Well, yeah, it's the same situation we have right now with the vaccines. I mean, we're so close to the treatment. We've had very little time to examine what long-term, effects are going to take place, which is why there are so many people like myself that are kind of like, I'll wait, I'll see. Like, we'll see what happens. I'm not really extremely afraid of the virus. Therefore, I'm kind of like, I'll wait. I'm in my early 40s. I think I'll be all right.
Well, I mean, the reality is you have a exponentially higher chance of dying in a fiery truck crash fire. Gosh, say that really fast 3 times. Truck crash fire. You have a much higher chance of dying that way than you do of this virus. Getting this virus. I mean, I think the last statistic I saw, I think you've got technically like a 3% chance of dying just from something random every day. Right? Just stepping out your door, or not even stepping out your door. And you have a 99 point, especially in our demographic, because we're kind of close to the same age. I mean, we have a 99.95% chance of coming out of it okay if we get it, which I still have a very hard time believing that. I mean, I don't care if you're vaccinated or not. Everybody in this country at some point in time is going to end up with it. I mean, if it's especially with it mutating, and I just David actually sent me a video of I don't know if you saw it or not, that virologist who's basically saying that the mass immunization during the pandemic is actually going to have a lot worse long-term repercussions because basically we're replacing or helping our immune system now with the one original strand, but we're not going to be able to replace what's been lost in the memory, so to speak, with our, it's not, in other words, like with if we start encountering the mutations, the mutations are already going to have a knowledge base to work off of, because we've already been immunizing during a pandemic and getting the virus used to the antibodies, the treatment that we're giving. And it's going to basically be, we're in the process of, like, they equated it to like boot camp, for example. Like you want a soldier to go to war, you send him to boot camp to train him for that without putting him in war yet. But that would be like letting the enemy kind of spectate the boot camp, and kind of like, I don't know, basically let them, like, give them the inside information so that when they go to war, they already know how to fight you, essentially.
Right. It's like training Al Qaeda before Al Qaeda attacks us.
Yeah. And then also making kind of the analogy too of using an antibiotic for, a bacterial infection, but not finishing the whole course. It's
Right.
kind of like the equivalent they gave for this immunization during the pandemic. So it made a lot of sense to me, as far as, at least, once again, whether he's right or wrong, it's a question that should be asked, and
Right. Well, and that's the problem right now, is we're not supposed to ask questions.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yep.
So.
Yeah, I know, man. Trust me, it's been the most frustrating year of my life, I think, career-wise. I mean, I can imagine. Like I said, I've been doing this for 16 years, and I've never felt misled or just overall jerked around or lied to as much as I ever have in this last year. And
Right.
really just kind of feeling more or less powerless to do anything about it, to be honest. But yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
But yeah, man, overall, things are all right, though, for the most part. I mean, the only blessing that's come out of it for me is I managed to pay off a lot of debt, and am able to fix up my house that's needed fixed up for about a decade now, and do stuff with it and other odds and ends. But it sucked being away from home as much as I have been this past year. But
trust me, I know all about that.
Yeah. But
yeah.
But yeah, man. Anything else you want to? I don't know how much more time you got, but
I got to get rolling here in a minute. But just plug anything you got to plug, man. We'll leave it at that. I think that's a lot of information. And if any of my listeners have any questions that we didn't cover, I'll have you back on. We'll do it again.
Yeah. I mean, we could probably go on another hour of this stuff if we let ourselves. But
I could.
But yeah.
I can talk about almost anything for an hour.
Yeah. Anymore, I kind of can too, which is ironic because I've been such an introvert most of my life, which kind of goes against, like, I shouldn't like podcasting and stuff as much as I do. But I've come to really enjoy it, which is ironic considering I'm really not that much of an extrovert at all. But
me too.
But yeah, I mean, anybody who wants to check anything out, what I do for the most part, can just go to my website at Jonathan, Jonathan, Munnier, Munnier. So JonathanMunnier.com, all one word. And a lot of links to my stuff are on there, my music stuff and different odds and ends. If you want to check out like the other podcasts that I do with a bunch of music buddies, odds and ends, stuff like that, just search the Too Many Strings podcast. It's on pretty much every major platform. I also do a falconry podcast too. That's Falconry Told. And that's a whole other conversation we can get into some other time about that if you want. But yeah, I mean,
I'll have to go listen to your podcast. I know nothing about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting hobby / sport for sure. But or even you can even also call it an alternative lifestyle. But at any rate, I also have a couple odds and ends music projects. But yeah, just go into my YouTube link. That you can get to from my website and stuff. Like I said, you can see some of the different little things that I've done, and yeah, just go from there. I guess it's a good starting point.
Yeah, I'll put links in the show notes so people can find you.
Cool. Yeah, like I said, anything else I can just get you after the fact or whatever. But I appreciate you having me on, man. It's been good, kind of meeting you for the first time here, and like I enjoyed listening to you and David's episode too. Whenever
I appreciate that. He was actually texting me just a few minutes ago.
Yeah, he's a good dude, and like I said, I'll have to go back and listen to some of your other episodes too, because from your podcast, because there's a lot of things that I've wanted to kind of start educating myself on that I know enough to be dangerous, and basically just a step past ignorant about, but I would like to learn a lot more of. And I don't like really necessarily identify myself with any political party either, but if I was to, and I would probably be mostly libertarian. So,
but
I think a lot of people would, honestly, they just don't know it.
Yeah. That's what my daughter tells me. She's like, everybody's a libertarian. They just don't know it yet.
If you're gonna play this game of pick and choose, well, it's a game that was made for you to lose. It doesn't really matter how many times, it's the same old worn out stories, same old lines. They're all pointing dirty fingers in hypocrisy, bragging on their feats of mediocrity again. Never really making any kind of change, but they keep on getting re-elected, and I find that strange. And that's why I say fuck them, don't feed them, cause we don't even need them. I never celebrate the tyrants that are taking our freedoms. Yeah, I said fuck them, don't feed them, cause we don't even need them. I never celebrate the tyrants that are taking our freedoms. What's it gonna take for you to see that we're living in a rigged democracy? People stand in line for the thieves that they've been choosing, paying no attention to the rights they keep on losing. But they all gather in the rallies and they chant their names on goddamn well that it's all gonna be the same. Just 4 more years of war and taxes, 4 more years of them grinding down their axes. And that's why I say fuck them, don't feed them, cause we don't even need them. I never celebrate the tyrants that are taking our freedoms. Yeah, fuck them, don't feed them, cause we don't even need them. I never celebrate the tyrants that are taking our freedoms. Don't feed them cause we don't even need them. We'll never celebrate the tyrants that are taking our freedom. Fuck them, don't feed them cause we don't even need them. We'll never celebrate the tyrants that are taking